Welcome to the Mental Mastery Show, where your host, Max Wigan, interviews world-leading experts from sports, business, and psychology on what it takes to unleash your potential and master your mind. Let the show begin.
Today, I'm so excited to talk to one of the world's leading mental game coaches, Jared Tendler. After becoming a licensed mental health counselor, Jared started working with some of the world's best golfers and poker players to help them perform at their best. He's also author of The Mental Game of Poker, number 1 and 2. So Jared, super excited to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Max. Good to be here, man.
Now, it's really going to be fun for this audience, for anyone that's into golf, anyone that's into poker, or at least into high performance in any field of life, I think. And Jared, the reason I was so really desperate to get you on the show is I love your gift for really going deeper than sort of the sometimes superficial techniques and tools that oftentimes are talked about in sports psychology especially. And you really have this gift for really drilling down to the core of the issue, to those underlying mental, emotional blocks, to those underlying belief systems that oftentimes hold us back. So maybe as an intro, can you share with us a little bit what you mean by sort of the mental game when you talk about that, and why emotions are so important, and really, mastering the emotional game and to really, being able to perform at our best in our lives?
Yeah, so when a lot of people hear the term mental game, they think it's synonymous with like mindset. And for me, there's a difference, because mindset, as it is typically described at, from the sports psychologist or advice that you were just kind of alluding to, it to me implies this idea that you can somehow actually master your mind and achieve this way of thinking and this mindset that is kind of permanent. And the people who are promoting that kind of ideology, I don't think they are intentionally trying to promote that kind of a way of thinking, but that's what their advice is generally suggesting. That if you suddenly kind of just like adopt these ways of thinking, then you will achieve this sort of mental game or mindset perfection, and your job is done. There's not a lot of thinking kind of beyond that. And for me, I like the term mental game because it implies that the mental and emotional functioning that we're trying to uncover and understand, it has a strategy to it. There's a game to it. There's an evolution to it. And it is not tic-tac-toe. It is poker or golf or trading, where there's a constant evolution. And so, one example of this is just the way that people treat the zone, right? The zone is very often viewed as being this sort of peak of functioning, that once you achieve it, you're kind of suddenly, you're constantly trying to return to that state. And to me, it's the exact opposite. Once you reach the zone moves, it evolves. Like the technique as a poker player, a trader, golfer, not mentally, the technique that is involved in what it is that you were doing you're going to need to be slightly better the next time around to reach the zone again. From a mental and emotional standpoint, there's an evolution that exists with regards to the depth of your focus, the depth of your presence, the depth of your decision making. All of that evolves. And so the quality of the zone that existed for me and my clients a year ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago is not the same. We are not trying to return to the zone as it existed in a prior state. And what you see a lot of times is the advice is, think back to a prior time that you were in the zone and use that as a trigger or as a primer, as an anchor to try to help you to return to it today. And to me, that is actually like holding you back from achieving the kind of evolution that really is required to continue to perform at a higher level and a higher level as well.
That's really so interesting. And one of the metaphors that I heard you share before is this idea of inchworm learning. I think that really sort of plays into that. So can you maybe elaborate? Because that, for me, that metaphor really, hit at home this concept of sort of always trying to evolve.
Yeah. So an inchworm, for those who are not familiar with it, is about a 1 inch long caterpillar that has legs on the front and the back end. And so they don't move like a regular caterpillar where they're flat along the ground the entire time. What they do is they kind of walk, where the front end kind of lifts up and extends so the body is straight. And then the back end lifts up and kind of does a little slinky action and kind of condenses, anchors again, and then moves forward. And so what you see is that over time, this inchworm moves by moving the front end forward and the back end forward. And when you look closely at an inchworm, they look like a bell curve. And a bell curve is basically a sample of, in my case, would be a sample of your decision making, a sample of your shot making, a sample of any kind of pieces of your performance you can chop up. And over time, what you'll see is a range, right? There will be days where you're playing great and on your A game, days where you're playing like crap and on your C game, and then days where you're playing or performing more averagely. And when you look at a large enough sample over a 3, 6 month, 9 month period of time, that bell curve starts to emerge where there's small frequencies of high performance A game, small frequencies of C game, and the average kind of ends up in the middle. And that's like a kind of a normative sample. Of course, it can be skewed more towards higher levels of A game or more towards higher levels of C game if you're in a slump and performing quite poorly. But the key is that Inchworm provides a connection between learning and performance. So the bell curve is a snapshot of your performance. Inchworm shows how learning happens over time, where in order to truly move that front end forward, for your best to get better, very often your C game has to be eliminated, or at least your current C game has to be eliminated. That back end has to move forward. Otherwise, your range gets too wide. And when your range is too wide, your performance is very hot and cold, lots of ups and downs. You don't get in the zone very often. You have no idea why you get in the zone. It feels very random and unpredictable. You actually rely on getting hot. This is a trait of many performers. They get hot, and when they're not, they're just not, and it just is what it is, and they just kind of wait around, like hoping one day it's just going to snap and turn around. They have very little control of the performance to the degree that it's possible. They're also like kind of looking for the next thing, like that thing that is going to sort of perceived to be solving their performance. So there's a lot of, and actually it will also cause a plateau, right? You're not going to be able to learn as much because there's not as much space for you to learn new things. So being able to like push that back end forward is what can kind of restart and jumpstart the engine for learning new things and kind of getting out of that plateau. And it can be the thing that actually helps to create the level of consistency, not only in their performance, but also in their improvement that's really possible.
Wow, yeah, I really love this concept, and partially also because in my personal life, so I ran cross country and track in college, right? And I had just a huge range, right, from between my A game, my C game for a very, very long time. And at some point, my coach sat me down, right, and she was like, Max, like, you have some amazing races and some amazing workouts, but then you have races and workouts that are just total crap, right? And I was like, yeah, that's true, right? What's going on? So we really worked for a long time on sort of closing the gap, and that was really powerful thing for me to really get this process going of really understanding why on some days I was so far off of like the maximum performance, right, or what I knew I was capable of. So can you maybe share for people that are listening to this right now what that process looks like of sort of moving your C game further up ahead and making it better?
So first thing is you got to define it very clearly. One of the things that I've noticed very often is that people have an idea of what their C game is, but very often they're trying to ignore it. They're trying to avoid it. They don't want to think about it. It's those things.
You just don't want to.
Yeah, exactly. Just, and they'll make excuses. It's like, oh, that's so unlike me. Oh, it just happened. Whatever.
Yeah,
like,
just once, right?
About it, move on. Like all these things. And so, what that mentality does is it creates a huge hole in your awareness of exactly what is happening, what is going through your mind, what emotions are present, and for what cause, what changes in your technique exist at that point. So you have to really do a good job of mapping it and then really understanding exactly what the cause of it is. And in my experience, C game, upwards of 90% is caused by mental and emotional flaws. In other words, the tactical, technical stuff that occurs then is so basic to you, which is oftentimes why it's so hard to kind of wrap your mind around, like why you would be that bad. Like, better, just don't do it, right? But like knowing that and being aware of that is not enough to stop you from doing it, which means that there's something else at play here, which is why we have to figure out and understand the emotions that are present there. Like, are you getting pissed off? Are you losing confidence? Are you getting anxious and, kind of buckling under the pressure? Are you overconfident? Lost motivation, lazy, bored? All of those things can be reasons for why you're going to perform at that level. Not to mention, fatigue and extreme, kind of tiredness or overtraining, things of that sort. But aside from like the physical stuff like that, your C game is by and large caused by mental and emotional stuff, and you have to identify it and then come up with corrections to it. Otherwise, your C game is going to be like dragging like commando style, like that. The inchworm is flat and it's dragging itself forward versus really taking that firm step forward, which happens after you start to correct the mental and emotional flaws.
There's such an important point right here, I think, because oftentimes we're sort of focused on those, like I mentioned before, superficial kind of techniques and tools, right? The mantras, and I love mantras, I still use them, right? But oftentimes I think they're sort of like just the first line, the basis, right, that we're using to try to overcome those emotional issues, which oftentimes doesn't work. So that's really, really interesting what he's saying here, that those are really some of the deeper lying issues that oftentimes we're facing. So is that like an insight that you got from, being in counseling psychology for a while? And is that sort of how you sort of wrapping your head around this idea that that's really those underlying issues that we're facing often in athletics?
Well, so yes and no, right? I wanted to play professional golf and found my own mental hangups were stopping me from doing that. And I went into the traditional psychology, sports psychology world to find answers, and they weren't sufficient enough. I improved, and to your point of like the superficial stuff, oftentimes can work, but if it doesn't, it means there's something deeper. And that's the point. If it works, great.
Yeah.
The problem is simple. It was not that complicated. But if it doesn't work, it simply means the problem is more complicated than you understand. And what I found was that sports psychology, golf psychology was not complex enough to really understand what was causing my failure. And some of the failure was just a complete misperception of anxiety and nervousness. And I don't think they did a good job of kind of like explaining the sort of normal anxiety that exists when you're competing. And I, kind of got into competitive golf late. And so that was just something that I hadn't quite learned at that point. Now it's pretty much mainstream at this point, that nerves are a good thing. But it wasn't 20 years ago. And so because I didn't get answers back then, I dove into counseling psychology because I reasoned that therapists were just really good at understanding like the underlying causality and kind of digging deep into problems. And so I wanted to learn that skill set because sports psychologists to me weren't very good at that. So if I can kind of combine those 2 points, then I'd have a pretty robust program that could still do the superficial stuff when necessary. But, more often than not, we need the harder hitting advice or understanding, and that's where the sort of the therapist side of me comes in. And so, being able to identify that C game is, kind of largely caused by mental and emotional stuff just happened through just observation over time. It was like, all right, well, if it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's a freaking duck, right? Because you can't, it just doesn't make any sense that you would do something randomly. Right? Like, why, if you are capable and know very, very clearly what the proper technique is, right? Swinging the golf club, getting your legs to move properly, basketball player, hitting jump shots, actor in terms of their delivery of lines. If you know what to do and know it very, very clearly and have made tons of mistakes to help you, it just doesn't make any sense why that training wouldn't just automatically prevent you from performing so poorly. The only logical explanation is that there is emotion that is capturing and breaking down your physical technique or your mental and emotional processing such that, right, your higher brain function isn't working. You can't think as clearly. That is the power that emotions have. That's the only explanation that I can come up with to cause, C game other than extreme fatigue.
That is really so fascinating. And 2 things really I want to highlight. First of all, I love this sort of trajectory that you took from struggling with your own mental game to then studying psychology, because that's exactly what I'm doing right now. So in high school I was struggling with it, right? And that's how I chose then to go into positive psychology now. and to really just learn more about the mind. But then secondly, what I wanted to point out was what you just said right here about emotions. And I wanted to, I'm really curious, does this happen both for positive and negative emotions? Because negative emotions, obviously, they sort of, weigh down, but does the same happen for intense positive emotions? So like intense joy, intense excitement, for example, before competition, does it do the same thing to your mental abilities?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah. Intense joy is equally as problematic as intense anger as it relates to decision making or execution. Right? It's a distraction. It shuts down higher brain function. So overconfidence, same kind of thing. You can be overly confident, and what happens when you're overly confident, like your visual or mental perception actually starts to be processed differently, where you're going to interpret the action differently. So, a common example would be you've got a big lead in a race, or a football team, basketball team has a big lead in a game. And so what happens, right? All of a sudden now you become more defensive. You're protecting a lead that you think is yours. And so then your interpretation of your opponent's actions are going to reflect that, versus staying really stable in your confidence, having your mind be as sharp as it needs to be. And so your perception and your ability to adapt and respond remains as agile as we want it. Right. So yes, positive emotions can be equally as problematic as negative ones.
That is an important point I think you're making here, for sure. So if I'm understanding you correctly, would it be, I mean, I know it's obviously not possible to be completely emotionless, I guess.
That's actually not desirable.
Exactly. So that wouldn't be desirable, but what would that look like then? Like sort of on an emotional basis.
So the ideal is that you are full of emotion, but that emotion is very balanced. Right? Like we can look at like anger and fear as being fuel for the zone. Right? If you are a person who tends to be a bit flat, right? Like there are lots of athletes you can think about. Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, kind of the two examples that come to mind, ones that I know best, who have used anger as great fuel. Like anytime that somebody questions their ability, doubts that they can do something, I mean, bam, like it drives them. And that was what can be a driver of great success. But that kind of volatility in the hands of a novice is really dangerous. They don't know how to contain it. The anger spills over and it becomes problematic and makes them perform poorly. Like Jordan and Tiger are experts at fueling themselves and understanding how to fuel themselves, right? Regardless of whether it's anger or others, which, they use fuel for other reasons as well. Point is, we want the emotion to be balanced and contained, and that is what we're after. We're not after this like robotic, emotionless state. When you are in the zone, right, you are full of energy and emotion, right? Passion, enthusiasm, interest, curiosity, being challenged, the intensity of competition. All of those things create emotion. And when we are typically in the zone, it's because that emotion has a purity to it. There's a balance to it. There's not the volatility that can swing you wildly in one direction or the other. And so for me, like I look at my job as essentially trying to identify the contamination or the sources of volatility that exist and kind of clean it out. And when you clean it out, you're automatically more balanced.
That makes a lot of sense. So can you share maybe a little bit more about those sources of volatility, as you called them? Like what are some of the most common things that you find there in athletes?
High expectations, illusions of learning, confirmation bias, the desire for control, perfectionism, things like that, right? When we're talking about these like performance flaws, a lot of it has to do with just these basic flaws in the way that we're perceiving ourselves or the competitive landscape, how we learn, how we interpret our own actions. Like we as humans rely on feedback in order to learn. You can imagine a golfer hitting golf balls where they could still see perfectly, but there was like a big kind of sheet draped over, so the golf ball would be hit and would go in the air, but that golfer couldn't see where it went. Right? You remove that source of feedback And maybe they would be fine for, 10, 20 shots. But if that continued for days and weeks, their performance would significantly go down, right?
For sure.
We need sources of feedback in order for us to respond and adapt and be able to learn properly. When those sources of feedback, which primarily come through our own mind, our own perception, become flawed in some way, right? Then all of a sudden we start to believe things that aren't true. We believe things about our own confidence that are either not true in a positive sense or not true in a negative sense. So if you think that you should correct a piece of your technique instantly, so this isn't a mental thing. This is just a learning processing thing, right? And so you think you should learn it, or you make a common mistake, which is, I did it in practice, I should do it in a game. I did it in a game, I should do it in the playoffs. I did it in the playoffs, I should do it in the championship game. If you believe that there's equal, that it's easy to make the transfer between those different situations, then you are making a fundamental flaw in understanding the nature of competition. For most people, now there are some that just naturally are kind of the gamers and can step up. But for most people, there is a real transfer that has to occur where it's not just expected that what you did in practice is going to translate into the game, right? But if you make that expectation, then your interpretation of the feedback that you're going to get in that game is going to be flawed, and it's going to cause you to make adjustments that are not accurate and create chaos. And then as you perceive yourself underperforming, guess what? You're going to start to get pissed off. You're going to get anxious. And so the spiral downward is going to get worse. And the whole problem began with a faulty expectation about how you transfer your skills from practice to competition. That singular problem can cause a whole host of mental and emotional chaos that has nothing to do with the mind per se. It's just a failure in understanding the learning and performance dynamic.
Wow, that is so interesting how those sort of underlying beliefs about us and the world and how we operate really affect then our mental game on that day. That is so fascinating that like those expectations can really backfire sometimes, even if we tend to think it's a good thing, right? To have high expectations and believe it's going to be great, right? But it's so interesting what you're pointing out here, that sometimes that can really backfire if we think too much about, this is going to be, it's just going to transfer easily.
Correct.
Love that point. Now, how do you help athletes, for example, that really on a losing streak? They've been losing games now, maybe for a couple of weeks, and they really just aren't able to find that momentum again. Like, what do you do with those kind of clients that are really struggling to sort of get back in the game?
So it depends on like kind of at what point I'm seeing them for the first time. If it's a client that I've known for years and they're in a struggling spot, the first thing I'll do is ask them, do you suck less? So when we look at Inchworm, right, like one of the fundamental things that you're doing to help to improve that back end to move forward is that on the days where you're really struggling, you know exactly what you need to do to suck less, right? What is it going to take for you to just push that back end forward, even if it's just a little bit? And so if their answer to me is, yeah, actually I do suck quite a lot less. All right, well then we find out what specifically is part of this current suckiness. Why is it that you're sucking? What are the specific things that are happening to your skill set? What do we think is the cause of it from a mental and emotional standpoint? What are the circumstances with which it began? There's a diagnostic process to it. Now, if the answer is no, actually, I suck equally as I did 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, then that tells us that the progress that we had seen prior and the analysis that we had done prior means that it wasn't sufficient. There was something that existed a year ago that we didn't identify. And so this current situation, we hope, is going to be sufficient to identifying what it was. And if we do our job well, which oftentimes happens, right, then we can find out what that flaw is, start correcting it. And then not only are they going to be back kind of at the high they were before, but they're going to be more stably able to keep it there and avoid dropping off for that same reason. And again, if, yes, we still don't have enough information and 6 months later, they're back sucking just as bad as they were, same deal. Are you sucking for this reason? Very often the answer is no, right? Like the reasons that we identified in the first phase and the second phase are not what we see in the third phase, right? There's something else that we need to uncover. So, it's a complex process. But again, if you interpret, and this is what most people do, if you interpret that return to suckiness as being caused by the exact same thing, then you're gonna kind of like miss the opportunity to uncover more of what is actually missing. Now, in all cases, we still need to really understand like exactly what that cause was, right? Do good diagnostics, and that's the majority of it. Most people, again, they are just hoping to just like kind of snap their fingers and one day wake up, or they wake up in the morning and today's a new day.
Yeah.
And today's the day I'm going to solve this, and it's just fantasy. It goes back to the easy kind of light surface level answers. Just be optimistic. Oh, you'll figure it out. Figure out what? How the fuck did I get here? How did I get here? You don't have the answer to that, then you're not going to be able to prevent it from happening in the future, right? If you're walking down the street and it turns out that there are manhole covers that are open, holes in the ground. If you're walking down the street and all of a sudden you fall in a hole, you're like, how the hell did I get here, right? Climb out, and you're walking along again and fall in another hole. If it turns out that you just need to look down to see that there are holes in the ground, then all of a sudden you've solved the problem, right? But so often, right, we just keep looking for the hope and the mythology that it's just going to instantly kind of pop out. We're going to instantly figure it out. And sometimes it happens because, enough time goes by where one day, right, your back's up against the wall, you're like completely resolved. The pressure has risen to such a high degree that you're now kind of fully motivated, or you've just like kind of given up and you're like, you just F it, like the hell with it. Like I give up. And then instantly you kind of figure it out. And so then what happens is you start to create dependency on actually hitting rock bottom to get yourself out of the slump on your own, rather than just looking down and figuring out what these holes are in the ground that are causing you to fall. If you figure those out, you get to close the manhole cover, and then you can walk around not worrying that you're just going to fall underground at any moment.
Wow, for every athlete listening to this right now, or really anyone interested in peak performance, I think this is really the holy grail of really beginning to identify what's actually blocking you. Because I think, from personal experience and, just knowing a whole bunch of other professional runners, it's so easy to kind of avoid that, right? To want to hide from it, to want to distract yourself from it with, just thinking about literally anything else, with coming up with excuses and justifications and, oh, the course wasn't right today, or my shoe hurt, or like whatever it is. Like, we tend to focus so much on those external things and never want to actually, put the blame on ourselves. So really, really love what you're saying here about, just really taking responsibility and, looking down on the floor, actually seeing what is tripping me up, right? Because if you don't do that, then like you're always going to keep going and over again, making the same mistakes. So really love that.
Yeah. Well, what's that Einstein quote, right? Like, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing, expecting different results. But very often people just don't know what the other thing is. And it is just looking down and really understanding what is in your crap, what is in your C game. That's the thing that's tripping you up.
For sure. Now you have this amazing model of mental game fish versus sharks. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So basically, in poker, a fish is somebody who's a really weak kind of basic player. They oftentimes don't even know how bad they are. And as a result, they're overconfident, right? They think that they're, quite savvy, but they're so incompetent that they don't even know how bad they are. Now, from a mental and emotional standpoint, there are a lot of people who are like kind of mental game fish, right? That they think that they're actually quite strong mentally. And so in my first book, I had a list of 17 things that poker players oftentimes think about or assume is true. For the most funny one is poker players oftentimes will say the word or say the phrase one time, which means that as the cards come out, they want that card, like they want the one card that's going to help them, or they want the card that's going to allow them to kind of get lucky and win. And so they'll say one time, and they're really going to like passionately say it and believe it. You can look on YouTube and see lots of examples of it. And it's kind of a funny example because most poker players prior to me calling it out would have never assumed that that was a problem. And I still don't believe it's a problem, but what it does do is it reflects a belief that you have some control of the card coming out, because it makes no logical sense why you would say one time unless you believe that maybe it's actually going to work.
Maybe then I can convince it to come out the right way. Like,
yeah, exactly. Otherwise, you
say
like, come on, or like you're cheering it on, but you're not saying like, give me the one card that I need, or give me the card that I need in a very kind of compelling way. Now, yes, some poker players say it in like fun and light and it's joking. It's fine. But it's just like a funny example of like an illusion of control that very often exists, like kind of deep in the recesses of our psyche. And a lot of poker players, a lot of people don't necessarily understand that those things that we say or the things that we do can be illustrative, can kind of help to be a highlight or a spotlight on those deeper flaws.
Wow, that's so interesting. And also one other thing that I learned in one of your videos or podcasts also was the Dunning Kruger effect, right? Can you elaborate maybe on that? Because I thought it was really fascinating relating to confidence and games.
So, basically what I was just talking about the, kind of fish thinking that they are good even though they're really bad. That's actually one side of the Dunning Kruger effect. So the idea is that people who are so unskilled lack the skill to evaluate their skill, and they overestimate it. And like in general society, you see this a lot with surveys of people and in their ratings of their intelligence, of their attractiveness, their sense of humor, any other traits or characteristics that are somewhat related to their personality or how they look. And for the most part, 70-ish, 75-ish% of people believe that they have above average IQ. And obviously statistically that's an impossibility. So
doesn't quite make sense.
No clue how to evaluate themselves. And so they just naturally rate themselves as being better looking or better, in terms of sense of humor, etc. Now, you have the flip side of this. So Dunning-Kruger on the one side is overconfidence coming from incompetence. The other side is actually underconfidence, a loss of confidence coming from high levels of competence. And what you see here is that very often people who have an incredible amount of skill, they undervalue what they know because they falsely assume that everybody else knows what they know.
That's so interesting. So
what we see here, and this is like a fundamental thing in society, especially in politics. Being an American, this is a trouble spot right now.
Trouble spot for sure.
Trouble spot. I'll leave it at that. That you have people who falsely equate confidence with competence, and those are not equal.
That's
Here
true.
You have Dunning-Kruger effect. People who are so underskilled at evaluating themselves that they falsely believe that they're confident. And so then they display it and they act it and they feel it, and you think that they're really good. And a lot of times the underconfident people who are way more skilled start to think it too.
Yeah.
They lose confidence amongst these people who are like, you don't know what you were talking about. You're terrible at this thing.
I have no idea, but yeah.
No idea. Like watching, and I haven't watched American Idol in years, but watching like the American Idol auditions with people who were so bad.
Yeah.
But they thought that they were really good.
They're the best in the world, yeah.
So you have these people who are so underconfident and yet so skilled because they are making a fundamental misperception of their skill. So same deal. Misperception of confidence and competence being equal to each other, and being inaccurate in terms of your understanding of your actual competence can cause wide ranges of emotional expression, which basically tells you that confidence doesn't really mean a whole lot when it comes to predicting outcomes. Okay, that without fail, a person's skill is the greatest predictor of their success. Now, if you have an environment where people are incredibly well matched with regards to their skill, what is going to win out? The person who is lacking confidence or the person who is overconfident? Hard to really tell. Certainly not. It's not like a perfect formula, right? If I were to define like the ideal level of confidence, 0 would be no confidence, 100 would be way overconfident, 50 would be the perceived like middle, 51 is the number.
That's so interesting.
Be just a tiny bit overconfident, because what that overconfidence is presuming is that, like, if you were at 50, you'd have the perfect ability to know what your skill set is. That's why it's, a little theoretical, because it's impossible to know exactly what your skill set is at any one point in time. So by choosing 51, what I'm saying is assume that you're just a little bit better than you actually are until you gain proof, one way or the other. And then if it, confirms what you believe, then you're back at 50. If it doesn't confirm what you believe, then you've identified things that are required for you to actually improve. And so then you're back at 50 because you've improved that stuff or it. But again, just be a little bit overconfident.
But that's so interesting, because I think in general, as society or humans, and myself certainly included, I think we often tend to want to be more confident, right? Probably more than 51, maybe not quite 100, but more like 70, 80, 90, whatever, right? We always want to have this intense confidence and certainty. So it's really interesting what he's saying here about, really not focusing so much on sort of confidence, but really more on realistically sort of assessing your skills and actually knowing where you stand and not being overconfident, or obviously not being underconfident. So that's a really interesting point.
So the only people for whom that's not true are the people who are using confidence to get what they want. Okay.
Yeah.
You need to become more competent at using confidence to their advantage. Everybody else develop the skills to become more confident in a real way because their competence is improving as well. That's what matters, right? Not what you believe that you can do, but what you can actually do.
Yeah.
So if we're walking around here at 70 and 80 in terms of confidence, we're living lies.
You're just a talker, yeah?
Yeah, we're standing on top of bullshit.
Yep. Love that. 100%, 100%. Now, you're working with some of the best of the best, right? Whether it's in trading and golf and poker. So are the challenge that your clients are facing, are they similar to what some of the beginners are facing mentally? Or is it really just a whole lot of sort of deeper issues that, because they've already mastered sort of the superficial, like I mentioned before, sort of tools and techniques of mantras and all of these things?
So beginners, if they have mental game issues at the start of their trading career, at the start of their golf career, those are 100% personal. They are personal problems. They are personal flaws with regards to how they learn. You don't have enough experience to have built up mental game problems that are contextually relevant to that sport or that game or that activity. Okay. So they're always personal. So when I work with somebody at that level, we talk a little bit about poker, we talk a little bit about trading, but then I go for the jugular and go deep and try to understand, how does this problem show up in the rest of your life? How does it show up in the rest of the environments in which you care about? And sometimes the answer is, it doesn't show up as dramatically as it does in poker, trading, golf, etc., because I've never cared about anything as much as I do this. I put so much into this that they want so deeply in it, and so that desire, that intensity, draws out these weaknesses in a bigger way, but they still exist in their personal life. They just may not be able to kind of see them quite as clearly. When I'm working with, the more seasoned veteran elite of the elite, that still may be true, right? The issues that we're seeing now, may be personal. I mean, we may go back to like childhood stuff, which, is not what I do normally, right? That's kind of like the last line of defense, but more often than not, it might be subtle fine tunings. Poker players experiencing a tiny bit of hesitation, or a trader or a golfer, tiny bit of hesitation or doubt right at the moment of execution. what's causing it, and we will spend an hour on that singular moment. Wow. And try to identify and work through it. And sometimes we don't come up with a good answer, but the questions that I'll ask or the things that I'll kind of pose to them will help them to see the situation a little bit differently. And then they'll take notes afterwards, and they'll really try to gather up data. And we become like a detective in a sense, like just gathering up clues until it's a closed case, and we understand exactly what is producing that tiny bit of hesitation. And one of the characteristics of like kind of climbing the ladder like that and climbing, to become one of the elites is that kind of a spotlight on very, very small issues. And my clients take that approach because they understand there's a continual evolution. They don't believe that at any one point that they're sort of like solved mentally and emotionally. So there are periods of time where they are really, really competent. And I don't see them for 6 months to a year or even longer. Really competent, both in terms of where they are and their ability to keep improving. But then they come back when they encounter a problem that they can't solve on their own. And that's where my problem-solving diagnostic ability can kind of come in. But if you don't have that like constant desire for improving, constant desire for identifying, which very often athletes and performers do from a technical side, but not from a mental and emotional side, then you're just not going to see this stuff. You're going to struggle, quote unquote, randomly. It's not random. Yeah. It will feel random, right? When you are continually upgrading your mental and emotional technique to kind of sit along with your tactical technique, we take out all of the randomness, right? There's always going to be our desire is to take out all the randomness. There's always going to be some, because it's just not a solved game. But that's how you establish much more consistent control and stability and predictability for your performance.
Oh, that's such an important point. Yeah, to really continuously focus on upgrading, not just your sort of outside game, right? Not just your technique and your skill, but really also the mental side. So Jared, on this podcast, we always love to celebrate failure. So do you have a favorite failure in your life? One time when you've just failed miserably at something, but it set you up for later success, for greater happiness further down the line?
Well, I mean, the thing that started my entire career was choking, trying to qualify for the U.S. Open. So this was in 1997, summer after my freshman year of college. Playing at a pretty high level locally, within my, Division III college experience and some local tournaments, but trying to qualify for the U.S. Open was a different animal. And what pressure is really good at is exposing weakness. And my weakness at that time was with my putting. So tee to green, pressure helped me because I performed the best I'd ever done in my entire life, hitting tee shots and hitting shots at the green. But missing 3 or 4 foot putts was the difference between me moving on to the second stage of qualifying versus not. So big time failure. A trajectory for my career.
Wow, that's a really great story. Now, before I ask my final question, where can listeners connect with you online? What's your favorite platform, social media, whatever it is?
So social media is Twitter, at Jared Tendler. Website would be website is www.jaredtendler.com or jaredtendlerpoker.com.
All right, awesome. Love that. Now, my final question, what does mental mastery mean to you?
Continual ongoing process, a never ceasing mastering. The mastery is like an unceasing desire to continue to level up. Like it's like mastery is a verb, not a noun.
Thanks for listening to Mental Mastery with your host, Max Weigand. If you liked the show, please make sure to subscribe and check out maxweigand.com for one-on-one coaching and other life-changing resources. Until next time.